Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you to everyone who's joining us. We are here today talking about localization and inclusive power. This is a topic the community's been talking about for a long while, and yet there remains progress to be seen. So today we're exploring shifting power towards local and national actors and how the shift can be supported within business models. So thank you all for being here. Briefly introducing our speakers, we have Sophia Sprechmann. She's the Secretary General of CARE International, which is a global confederation of independent organizations working around the globe to save lives and end poverty, putting women and girls at the center. We have Yvonne Mulenga, Executive Director of Project Concern Zambia, which has a strong reputation for integrated, community-based programming focused on strengthening local capacity. We have Ignacio Packer. He's Executive Director of the International Center on Voluntary Agencies, ICFA, and that's a global network of NGOs whose mission is to make humanitarian action more principled and effective. And finally, we have Wolfgang Jamann, Executive Director of the International Civil Society Center, or ICSC, which is owned by 15 of the largest INGOs to maximize impact for a sustainable and more equitable world. So they're joining us from Ecuador, from Zambia, from Switzerland, from Germany. I'm Deborah Willig, joining you from the US. I'm Director of NGO Futures at Interaction, where we seek to help our member organizations and the sector adapt in a wildly changing world. So looking today at localization and inclusive power, there is so much happening across the sector, and time and energy are premium because our end impacts are really important. And it's hard to prioritize, especially when we don't have the path forward. In order to do that, tapping into our why for ourselves and our organization can often help with commitment to truly prioritize and honor a complex but imperative need. So starting with you, Sophia, I'd love to hear from everybody. Why does localization and inclusive power matter to you?
So this matters hugely because people should determine their future. We are just facilitators and supporters, although we need to recognize that we hold significant power, either real or perceived. In fact, if I may say, I love the term inclusive power. I'm not so crazy about localization because it does suggest, the term itself, that it's about localizing what INGOs may do, when in fact, what we're describing and what we are after is about locally led transformation, locally led change. I think that's a more appropriate term. And the change agenda, therefore, must really be in the hands of civil society that locally lead their journey, their transformation. We are there to be in solidarity with that. So let me also say, and probably state the obvious, that is that the role to support voices and to be in solidarity is important because local actors they should be central. They have the contextual understanding, they have the long-term presence, they have the commitment and legitimacy to drive the change they desire for their own lives, for their own context, both in long-term development and humanitarian response. And however, those desires, visions, dreams have often been overruled by an aid system, which often has imposed over the past. And this has eroded the capacity, the leadership, the agenda from the global south. This has actually been really in detriment of those agendas flourishing.
How about you, Yvonne? What is your why for really prioritizing all the energy and time and localization and inclusive power for you?
I'm leading a local organization that has emanated from an international NGO, and I'm seeing how this change is helping to transform communities and helping local people drive their agenda and not leaving it to just international NGOs or donor aid. I mean, COVID has shown us that development aid now, developed countries now have also their own priorities. I mean, look at what it has shown us, how they're grappling with their own health systems, and they need to be investing resources in their own countries. So very soon, we might not be having a lot of aid coming from international donors coming into our countries. So what are our host governments doing about it? What seat are they driving? How are they going to make sure that they start caring for their own people? The way we fought for independence, that we're going to manage our own countries, is the way that local governments should stand up and start caring for their own people. So for me, it's about inclusiveness in terms of the host government taking the driving seat, the civil society, that I think is now way over ready to do this, to take driving seat, and also the communities we serve. So this is what I have to say about that. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Yvonne. How about you, Ignacio? What is your big why that helps you keep this front and center?
I would take it from a very personal approach. I do try to practice inclusiveness in my daily life, in my family, in my community, in my role in the organization I lead, which is a very diverse network of humanitarian NGOs. And I must tell you, I learn every single day on the difficulties in practicing inclusiveness. I have biases. They're based on gender, on racial and other characteristics. But I believe that my own awareness of these biases does affect my actions and judgments. And I try to frame things with two key questions. Who is benefiting from the differences? And who is being made invisible? I know it by action and by omission. I have and I am still benefiting from a system that is constructed through dominant powers. And Sophie, the angle that you bring around the decolonization of aid is in the center of uncomfortable discussions. I do reflect on my privileges, on how I continue to use them. And I see inclusive power as a blend, as a mix of my ability to listen, of my emotional intelligence, or sometimes my lack of emotional intelligence, of having the willingness to give more than I take. And from making it personal, we have to move it into our organizational reflections. Our organizations and operations have to look in the mirror and talk about what hurts. And many of our organizations have embarked on this, but this is the starting point for more than just the cosmetic changes, and really to be aligned with our values. Due to my function, I'm regularly invited to speak, as today, and I always keep in mind the audience. So you're likely to have forgotten what I will say today. People also forget actions. And I doubt it is worth putting on my gravestone, for instance, that I worked so hard for many years to send so many emails and attended so many online meetings. No, what we say, what we do may not be remembered, but people will never forget how we make them feel. And our actions, words, and ways of working make people feel. And this has long time individual and institutional memory.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's indeed the truth. I think it was the great Dr. Maya Angelou that famously coined a phrase about how people remember the way that you make them feel. Wolfgang, what would you like to add for your big why that keeps you prioritizing localization and inclusive power, even while there's so much competing for your time and energy?
This is one of the transformations which is imminent, not just for, like Ivana said, for local governments, but also for the predominant players of the aid system of the last decades. The way we do this is we start internally, we work on more inclusive governance and decision-making models, and then we work slowly forward towards more legitimacy of the way aid is being delivered, or maybe it's even the wrong terminology, the power is being shifted and the like. In addition to this kind of professional perspective, of course, I also do have a personal perspective. I've been around long enough to remember an aid system that was incredibly characterized by these imbalanced donor-recipient relationships, and I'm using those words in full intentionality. The aid system has produced, and I've worked in many situations where so-called beneficiaries had not only lost their livelihoods, but also their dignity, partly because of the way aid was delivered. Now, mind you, this has been 20, 30, 40 years ago, and this aid system might have developed and matured, but of course we all have seen the failures in this system because of the insufficient consideration of local context, the overlooking of local capacities and ownership. And over the years, I personally have witnessed a lot of lip service in terms of how are we localizing and shifting power and making the collective work better and more legitimate. And there was also, and there has been some really ambitious changes to the system. I was part of large initiative headed by Mary Anderson years back, not just about doing no harm, but also about the vulnerabilities, the capacities that you find and don't need to build, but need to work with. There's been the development of rights-based approaches. There's been the development of highly ambitious standards on humanitarian aid. And there was, of course, the 2016 World Humanitarian Summit, which brought this agenda for humanity and localization. But there's so much room for improvement. And I think we are at a crucial point where we are able, and the time is ripe to make a huge step. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm curious, just staying with you for another moment, about some of the blockers and facilitators of localization and inclusive power. You touched on rights-based approaches and standards, and wondering if you could say a little bit more about what you've seen that's really blocking it or really helps it.
Yeah, I mean, you have to look at who are the traditional power holders in this aid system. It's donors, it's bilateral agencies, it's INGOs, and many of them will easily agree that localization is a good thing, right? I mean, we connote this with the consideration of local contexts, of vulnerabilities and capacities, true partnerships, inclusive decision-making, and the like. So there's a lot of rhetoric and narrative around this. And in theory, we even talk about changing funding patterns. This was a commitment that came out of the humanitarian summit. But the reality of this particular point is really rather far away. Now, when I speak from the perception of the organizations we work with, the ICSOs, their approaches to localization, again, rather positive narrative, lots of past achievements. Many of them have strong local chapters, huge armada of local staff, also in leadership positions. Many will say we have inclusive, decentralized local business models. But one thing I've realized, that until maybe some 5 years ago, the discussion of power was not likely to happen. And even the power shifts, which is a narrative that is so prominent today, hasn't been prominent 5 years ago. And it has become a promising new challenge for the sector, which is very, very difficult for the blockers to avoid and to duck. So, we're having some of these power shift discussion, and it's not easy to find an answer here. Because facilitators and blockers of power shifts are often not the same people and the same entities. So you really have to be almost tactical approaching this, and finding allies on the one hand, and also finding those who stand in the way. And for us, a very good idea is to link those power shift discussion very, very closely to the mandates that the organizations stand for, and that we all subscribe to. The closer we move to what we stand for, the easier or the more likely it gets to succeed.
Thank you. And Sophia, I'm curious, I know that power is something that's very interesting to you, and power relationships. Can you share a little bit from what you see about blockers and facilitators here?
Yes, of course. Thank you. And it's really interesting to hear everyone's perspectives. And I can so much relate to it, and I think we all would have a lot of anecdotes. When I joined in '94, I'm from Uruguay, from South America, and I was confronted with, I always had the dream of working for an INGO or in humanitarian and development and social justice and equality. That was my dream, and I was actually at that time quite in shock with what I found in terms of power dynamics. And I think we have come a long way, as you well said, Wolfgang, in terms of rights-based approaches, justice, power, all of these words really being part of our lexicon, our vocabulary. I also think we have a long way to go, and maybe someday I will do something with it, because as an anecdote, since I joined this line of work, in '94, I have kept in all of my notebooks in the last page a little page which I have called my colonial page, before we ever have talked about decolonizing aid. And I took note of what I saw, and that's why it's so close to my heart. So maybe one day when I retire, I may do something with it. But really looking at those blockers actually that manifest themselves in meetings and every single interaction in so many ways, in uncountable ways. And I think the main blockers are actually deeply entrenched and systemic, and they're hard to shake off. They're really hard to shake off. And I think there is one of them is just keeping to what we know best and what we're known for, that institutional inertia can truly be a blocker, and even worse, that the self-interest of holding on to power and resources. Donor policies and practices often do not help. There is a lot of pressure to uphold funding rules, especially in conflict-affected areas, for example, around anti-terrorism policies, as we have seen recently. And also, another, I think, if I may add one blocker, and Wolfgang mentioned really critical ones, also domestic political pressures in donor countries to kind of maintain the status quo, with and please constituents with focusing on superficial, often short-term quick wins, rather than the deeper, more complex, deep tissue work to address injustice and inequality. And all of this results in slow change, despite best intentions. And Wolfgang, you mentioned earlier the grand bargain. Despite its objective of shifting power, I think it has a long way to go to model what it preaches. We see that even with very well-intended initiatives. But let me come maybe to some of the factors that may facilitate and pressure change. I think I want to stress again the call for decolonizing aid and dismantling white supremacy. I don't think this can be stressed enough, because it has resulted in much more open and sincere conversations about where power lies, what more inclusive programs and responses should look like. And I think we all have, and Ignacio, you also made reference to it, have engaged in deep reflections about the role of international NGOs, of local actors, of national NGOs, of government, and everyone's role in actually sustaining the marginalization of local actors. So we've had uncomfortable and frank conversations about racist, sexist, colonialist attitudes and behaviors in our sector, and I think that's very positive. I think we have also gotten much more scrutiny from partners, and that's essential as well. Let me also add, maybe just finally, and I think that's actually quite critical at this time, that the locally led responses and inclusive power are not only absolutely critical from a value-based perspective, but also from the perspective of effectiveness, because we have seen that the humanitarian response needs and support needs are hugely increasing. We are entered a decade of unprecedented demand for humanitarian assistance in the context of climate change, crisis, now COVID, and all the consequences of COVID. Poverty is increasing for the first time in 2 decades, so we actually need more hands and brains and hearts and everyone involved. And in a way, strangely, and Yvonne, you made reference to that, the pandemic has helped also to facilitate change as a facilitating factor. It's not all negative, because it has also shown that it's possible to maintain humanitarian response programs under extreme constraints and without international travel, which is also much more carbon friendly. So there's more delegation of authority and not only delegation of responsibility to local actors. And the space has been created. There is a new normal that has helped change the mindset, and I hope we will never go back.
Yvonne, really curious to hear from you. With what Sophia and others have shared, what are you seeing as the blockers and the facilitators? What's really resonated with you, and what would you add?
For me, like what Wolfgang said about local capacity being overlooked for a very long time. And I totally agree with that. And I see that as a facilitator. I mean, as I said earlier, we have strengthened local capacity. We have a pool of local people who are talented, who are skilled, who can lead the development agenda in their own countries. So we have a ready platform for civil society to be engaged. For me, I see this as an easy facilitator that we can ride on. But I'm going back again when it comes to blockers. I don't know, maybe it's because I'm coming from sub-Saharan Africa and I really don't have kind words for the governments in sub-Saharan Africa. And I can say for me, really, it's about the systems in government. Because I go back again, we can't really continue looking at high-income countries to be leading the agenda, to be the ones who are pumping in money. What are we doing from all those income taxes, sales taxes, business taxes we collect to make sure that we develop, we're supporting social services in our own countries? How are we prioritizing that? We know that in most of our countries, the money that the governments collect, like in my country, it's so much rich in mineral resources in copper. But how are we making sure that the mineral royalties are going to supporting the right things and supporting the citizenry? For me, I still feel like really governments are lagging behind. And yes, I agree that donor community, the high income countries still have a stake. They still have a stake in ensuring equity in global health and supporting developing countries. But until the host governments are serious in using those resources properly, prudently, the governance systems should really be strengthened to make sure that the resources are trickling down to the right people.
Thank you. Thank you. Governance is huge. And Ignacio, as you gather local, national, international NGOs and look at this, what are you seeing and what resonates from your fellow panelists, both emphasizing the blockers, but also the facilitators? What is helping?
I think I'll build a little bit around three facilitators. Go a bit further because it's been mentioned around how the COVID-19 is a facilitator, but also how the climate crisis is a facilitator, and then perhaps move a little bit on looking at some parallel processes that I think are facilitators. We know it. We are in a vexing challenge, because we have to align international support, which is needed, with the local driven expertise, capacity, and priorities. And there were some really key elements in the discussion that came up of the blockers we have there. And I must say, many of us, and at IGVA, we are still hoping that the localization of aid delivery, when triggered with the travel bans and so on, has to become, or is hoped to become, the single biggest change in this pandemic for the humanitarian sector. Really to finally have this opening, this deliverance of the long-awaited reform agenda, and it was mentioned, the grand bargain and the commitments that we have taken on localization. And if it is needed, this pandemic has shown us how the acceleration of the localization of aid is essential. Needs that have just skyrocketed with resources not following, and we just hope we're not going to revert on the little progress that has been made in these last months. A number of local and national aid organizations are in constant struggle to survive. They are asking for stable long-term funding, that will allow them to grow and sustain local expertise. The strength of the humanitarian system is extremely strongly linked to these capacities at local level and to the diversity of and the number of civil society organizations. And of course, it's been mentioned, money, of course it's important, but what national and local leaders want is a greater role in making decisions. It's about that power shift that Wolfgang and others mentioned. And I think it's important now that we frame this need for an acceleration of the localization agenda, also compounding the risks from the COVID-19 pandemic and the climate crisis, because we still haven't seen the needs, how they're going to be escalating in the coming years, and how to respond to those needs. It is, if you don't do it for ethical reasons, do it at least because it just makes full sense. The environment, the climate, and humanitarian action is something on which, well, as IGVA, we're doing our annual conference on this. Our learning stream is on this, and of course that element of localization on how to empower local and national disaster and climate the authorities is so important. And very briefly on the last point that I think we're learning too with the pandemic is how it has mobilized local responders, but in a kind of parallel process, which is different from the formal humanitarian response. There is definitely an acceleration of localization going on, but it's not necessarily what the humanitarian system understands as localization. It's about local capacities doing something for themselves. And I think that is an area of work, certainly as IGVA, where we are very much engaged, and where we engage, of course, with a number of smaller national organizations, but also in our membership. We have some large members who are from Kuwait, who are from Turkey, from China, from Indonesia, and they have very different business models than the Western and the business model of the Western NGOs.
Thank you. And the business models can play a good amount into what this looks like. So I'm curious, and I'd love to start with Yvonne, promising ways forward. And if you have one thing that you want people to be remembering and embodying as they move on beyond this panel, what is it for promising ways forward in localization, inclusive power, power shift, power sharing?
I'll give an example of our local organization and how it started. For me, I mean, I really value the USA journey to self-reliance and the way they are leading in that way, because our organization really has seen the benefits of the journey to self-reliance as demonstrated by USAID and driven by USAID. We, as I said earlier, Project Concern Zambia was born out of an international NGO. And in doing that, the international NGO didn't do it that because they needed, because PEPFAR had given a target that local resources, PEPFAR resources should be shifted to local organizations. They intentionally did that. This is something that they intended to do because they've worked with this local team for a very, very long time. And they saw that they've developed local capacity. So they supported the local team, the people that had worked with them for years, the time they came to Zambia, and supported them to develop and to form their own local NGO. And in doing that, you could see that they did it wholeheartedly, not that because PEPFAR had shifted and they also needed to find a way of making money, but they really just did this to support a local team that they'd worked with for many years to form a local NGO. And in doing that, this local team was prepared to go for USAID funding using their new partnership initiative. And through this initiative, Project Concern Zambia got funding. And I like the way that USAID is using like co-creation workshops where they're letting local teams participate and lead in the way that proposals or maybe the theory of change is supposed to be done based on what is seen on the ground. So this is what we went through, not where a donor prescribed to you that this is we're requesting for proposals and this is what we want. They just first asked for a simple concept note. And from there, then they say, let's go through this co-creation together with you leading the way as local partners, local organizations. And we did that. And another thing I liked, I'm going back again to strengthening local government systems. They are also doing that as they support local organizations do that. They're also doing a government to government funding where they're helping to strengthen government systems for that project they're running so that the government is ready and prepared and they're strengthening those systems to help support that other project that's being led by local organizations. So for me, I see this as it's giving some good opportunity. And I think a lot of the donor community should take a leaf on how the journey to self-reliance and the new partnership initiative is being done. Also, just to add that, we, like as PCZ, we've gone through this. We've been prepared by an INGO, and we've got all this ready talent, people that are reform-minded, that are ready to help move this forward. But what we're doing is we're also supporting, we are TA to grassroots organizations that do not have the same experience and capacity as us. So we are strengthening these grassroots NGOs that are ready, very near on the ground, that have been delivering services right on the ground in the communities, but they do not have resources or they do not have the capacity. So we're saying, look, we're here, we've gone through this with an INGO, and we can rapidly help you reach the grassroots, reach the beneficiaries the way you do it well, but will support, strengthen your capacity. So for me, I feel like this really should be taken forward, and this is the leap that should be taken from all the donor communities.
Thank you. Strong capacity building, co-creation, local governance systems. I'm curious, Ignacio, you mentioned that you have a conference coming up that's focusing on this. What do you think we might hear there or elsewhere about promising ways forward?
Yeah, I think the key word that will be coming out is certainly around transformations. And that's certainly what has led the discussion that we had all last year with our membership, but with other stakeholders around what we've called the IGVA 2030, which is a strategy, but looking at a longer period, at 10 years, which will be adopted also in the General Assembly in a few weeks' time. And one of these transformations is around that element of how we embrace diversity. IGVA, we consider ourselves as a very diverse network. We have 130 members of all types of size and types of organizations, with the operational footprint of the members is $20 billion in 160 countries, an outreach of around 10,000 NGOs. So yes, we consider ourselves as a very diverse organization, but we have to transform that and go very much further than that. And that what is nested is one of the 5 big transformations that we have ambitions to transform progressively. And how do we do that? That starts by governance, by issues around governance, on how we do transform and achieve more diversity in the governance. It is around the work. Everything we do, it has to enter much more into the DNA. And when I talk about we, it's not IGVA a secretariat, it's IGVA a network. It's progressively all the members, and on which some of the members have strongly embarked in this journey, and some of them already for quite some time. So this certainly is what is driving and exciting around how we're going to be moving diversity within IGVA.
Awesome. Thank you, Ignacio. Wolfgang, across your network and the sector, what do you see as some promising ways forward that you want to lock into our audience's minds?
Very happy to mention kind of 2 things that stick out from where I sit. First of all, we work with a number of fairly ambitious international civil society organizations who have started putting local actors, the people we work with, their partners, the primary actors, into the center of decision-making processes. these are governance discussions in a wider sense, but they're not just about, how does a board or a general assembly look like. It's really putting processes and structures to the test, the way we currently work. And are these ways designed and capable and fit for greater inclusion? And it's quite an exciting journey. We don't have many easy answers here. There's a lot of diversity in finding responses, and I have to say, it's not an ambition without risks. Some of those organizations have encountered significant resistance, and one or two have actually even lost their leadership over those ambitions. So you need to be courageous to go that way. But I'm actually quite happy that we have, it's more than half of our shareholders and supporters who go that journey. So it's an exciting one, and I think we keep on informing the community over this progress on a regular basis. The other piece I wanted to mention, this is not us, this is another initiative that some of you might have heard about, the RINGO initiative, the Reimagining INGO initiative. It's something that is also in the early stages, but they've just published a survey of about, I think, 500 or 600 local NGOs about their perception. And, there was mixed perceptions of how the aid system works for them. And there was a surprisingly positive, depending on what you were expecting, appreciation of the partnerships that are there between local and international civil society organizations. There were critical issues like decision-making, which is uneven and not mutually beneficial. INGOs are expected to be facilitators, not implementers, something that we heard earlier also from Yvonne. More consideration of local capacities, not necessarily acting as funders. And there's, of course, the reality. And again, this has been said earlier, that many of those local NGOs are struggling for survival. It is a tough situation for many of them. So there needs to we all need to get out of our way to help each other here, particularly in these difficult circumstances. Now, in order to accelerate all of this, yes, we had COVID, we had climate change, and a couple of other big trends. Do we need a revolution? I have to say that I'm not a big believer in theoretical kind of high-flying systems change discussions and ambitions. I'm really getting a little bit almost tired of this jargon. We need to change the system, it has failed, whatever. I need to see, and I'd rather see and scrutinize concrete procedures around decision making. Really seeing all those examples where people make an effort, where people risk and really make an effort to strengthen and support and capacitate or support the capacities, particularly when it comes to resources. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. So putting processes and structures to the test, which is also something that Ringo is doing, and some concrete decision making. Sophia, bringing us home, what would you like to emphasize about promising ways forward?
Thank you. Maybe 5 points actually in terms of, and I'll be short in each of them, promising ways forward. First, I can't stress enough staff diversity. I joined an organization where there were a lot of international staff and, flying around the world. So, the fact that now more than 90% of staff of CARE are from the countries in which we seek impact, I think it's critical. Diversity and perspectives also come from, of course, diversity of boards, but also of maybe, informal advisory groups. And we have now an informal feminist advisory board, and I think that's super important that we set up those fora for really getting much more feedback and input. Second, representation within INGOs and NGO families, and that's the democratization within is essential. And again, I joined a CARE which was 11 members from the global north. Now we have 21 members of CARE International, of which 8 members, candidates, affiliates are from the global south. So many more organizations such as Yvonne's, and also one member, one vote. It shouldn't be the size of your organization that gets more of a say in decision making. So INGO families where there's more members from the Global South. CARE actually had an objective that by 2020, we didn't meet the objective. The majority of members of CARE International would be Global South organizations. We are now 13 to 8, so 8 from the Global South, but it was good to stretch our imagination to put that very ambitious target, which I hope we will meet soon. Maybe the third point I quickly wanted to stress is the importance also. Yes, we're talking about locally led transformation and change and social change and led by local actors. But locally led and globally connected, I think, is very important, because let's not forget that some of the causes of poverty actually reside in the global north. So I think INGOs still have a role to play in influencing the causes of poverty that reside in the global north. And that is by challenging power, mobilizing supporters in the global north. If there's poverty, inequality, humanitarian need in the world, it is not just because of what happens in the global south. So it is good to have locally led change, and we need to connect it globally so that, for example, the benefit of having organizations from the global south participating in CARE also through that voice, challenging power in London, in DC, in Berlin, in Vienna, that's in Paris, in many of the global north capitals. I would insist in this concept of locally led, globally connected. Fourth, I think we need to really focus on impact. It is not about where we have offices, but about where we have impact and influence, and really looking for example, recently and not so recently, already a couple of years, CARE is supporting the domestic workers movement in Latin America, and that's a really important part of our work in countries where we may have an office or not, where there's local actors that we can support. So it must be much more about where we are able to have influence and impact rather than an office. And finally, maybe the final point I want to make, it is essential to fund civil society organizations that represent and serve women, youth, other marginalized groups. There's still very little progress on that front. Actually, we just published a report last week where we show that 1% or less, actually, that funding of 11 big donors and UN agencies is going to women-led civil society organizations. So I think those would be my 5 main points. And of course, we need to continue doing internally the gender equality and diversity work, the inclusion work, and really scrutinize who are we speaking on behalf of and what is just not legitimate and wrong. So I think those are the points that I would like to stress.
Awesome. Hear, hear. To all who are joining us today, I urge you to write down a few action points that you've learned that you want to embody in yourself, in your organization. To all who are here on camera, thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your hard work figuring out things that don't have easy solutions. What you do matters. And with great gratitude, and I'm sure all who are tuning in, thank you.